In this video, we're going to talk about an important theory on inflation, and it's what's known as the quantity theory of money. Let's quickly revisit a table that we saw earlier. This table shows the inflation rates for some of the countries that have experienced the most extreme inflation rates in history. Recently, we see Zimbabwe had an inflation rate that on a monthly basis averaged about 7.96 times 10 to the 10th. Now, Zimbabwe's leader during this time was Robert Mugabe. And wouldn't we like a penny or 1,000 pennies for his thought? What caused Zimbabwe's hyperinflation? That's what we want to know, and that's what our quantity theory of money will help us understand. Let's start by introducing a few terms. First, the velocity of money. The velocity of money is the rate at which money changes hands. So let's define M as the money supply, the amount of money in the economy. V is the velocity of money. P, the price level. So it could be the CPI or the GDP deflator. And let Y represent real GDP. Then the velocity of money can be defined as this ratio. In the numerator here, we have the price level times real GDP, which is just nominal GDP. And you take that nominal GDP and you divide it by the money supply, you get the velocity of money. Basically what this shows us is if we're going to spend a certain amount of money on goods and services, but we only have a limited amount of money in the economy, the velocity tells us the rate at which that average dollar is being spent or the rate at which money changes hands. Let's illustrate it with an example. Suppose in our economy there's only one good that we produce. Let's say it's pizza. And we produce 3,000 pizzas per year. So our real GDP is 3,000 pizzas. The price of a pizza, and since it is the only good we produce, we'll use that as our price level. The price of a pizza is $10. That means then our nominal GDP is going to be $30,000. If we assume a money supply of $10,000, then the velocity of money is going to be equal to 3. In other words, we only have $10,000 worth of money in the economy, but we're producing $30,000 worth of goods. So that means that the average dollar was used in 3 transactions. So that's what the velocity of money is. It gives us some indication of how often each dollar is being spent on the goods and services that are being produced within this economy. Let's derive what's known as the quantity equation. If we multiply both sides of the velocity formula by M, we get this result. On the right-hand side, we have nominal GDP, which represents some amount of spending. And on the left-hand side, we also get an indicator of what the level of spending is. This is showing how many times each dollar in the money supply is being spent, specifically on the goods and services being produced. This is what's known as the quantity equation. And we're going to use the quantity equation to set out the quantity theory of money. The quantity theory of money does 2 things. It sets out the general relationship between inflation, money, real output, and prices. So these are a lot of terms we've seen already. We've seen the term inflation in this lesson. We have an indication, obviously, of what prices are. We know what real output is. And, of course, money is just anything that is generally accepted as a medium of exchange. We'll talk more about money in a later lesson. And this theory presents the critical role of the money supply in regulating the level of prices within our economy. So to understand, let's start with the quantity equation once again and make a few simplifying assumptions. We're going to assume that the velocity of money is stable. Now, velocity is determined by various factors, such as whether workers are paid on a monthly or a biweekly basis, how long it takes to clear a check or electronic transactions. Clearing a check just means if I write you a check and you deposit it in your bank, how long will it take for the funds to be transferred from my account to your account? And a third factor that can affect the velocity of money, how fast money gets spent, is how easy it is to find an ATM, for instance. How accessible are ATMs from which we can withdraw money. So factors like these, all of which affect the velocity of money, may change, but they change slowly. So the velocity of money, it's not uncommon to assume that it remains stable at some general level. So the velocity is stable, which means that if the money supply changes, given a constant velocity, then it's going to cause nominal GDP, the right-hand side of this equation, to change by the same percentage. So if the money supply changes by 5%, given a constant velocity, nominal GDP will also change by 5%. It's important to note that a change in the money supply does not affect real GDP. Real GDP is determined by technology and the real factors of production, the resources in our economy, the land, the labor, the capital that are used to produce goods and services. Having money does not help us produce goods and services. We need resources and technology if we want to produce more goods and services. Money will not help us do that. So when we change the money supply, so once again you have velocity is constant, we're putting more money into the economy, it has no effect on GDP, so GDP will remain constant. And so in summary, if you increase the money supply by 5%, nominal GDP will increase by 5%, but since real GDP doesn't change, that means that the price level is also increasing by 5%. So if you want to know what happened in Zimbabwe, and you want to know what happened in Germany and Peru and Hungary when they were experiencing all that hyperinflation, it was because there was a rapid increase in the money supply that was causing that rapid inflation. You were throwing a lot of money out there, and all that money was chasing a fixed amount of goods, and all it did was cause prices to increase. So the cause of inflation, per the quantity theory of money, if real GDP is fixed by real factors of production, and velocity is stable, then it follows that inflation is caused by an increase in the money supply. The quantity theory of money can also be written in terms of growth rates. So we've taken our quantity equation, and we've written it as follows. This represents the growth rate of the money supply. This is the growth rate of the velocity of money. And all that is equal to the inflation rate, because we're measuring this as a growth rate in the price level. That's just the inflation rate, plus the growth rate of real GDP. So we can do a lot of interesting things here with the quantity equation as expressed in absolute terms, and with the quantity equation as expressed here in terms of growth rates. Some important implication. So if the growth rate of V and the growth rate of real GDP are small compared to the growth rate of the money supply, then the rate of inflation will be approximately equal to the increase in the money supply. That just comes from the above equation. So if these are small, let's suppose the growth rate and the velocity is 0, and the growth rate in real GDP is also 0, then that means that the inflation rate is going to be approximately equal to the growth rate in the money supply. Alternatively, we can write this as follows. The inflation rate is equal to the growth rate in the money supply less the growth rate in real GDP plus the velocity of money. And all that does is that stems here from this identity. So how well does the theory hold up? In Peru, it holds up very well. So if we just use the quantity equation, when we held velocity constant and made it clear that putting more money into the economy is not going to cause real GDP to change, we said that the price level and the money supply will increase at similar rates. And here in Peru, we see that that trend holds very well. What about if we write it in terms of growth rates? The inflation and growth rates for Peru over this period of hyperinflation are given here on the right-hand side. Per the growth rate formula, which we derive from the quantity equation, the inflation rate should mirror the money growth rate, and that is indeed the case for Peru. What about if we don't have hyperinflation? Here we see a graph where we have the monetary growth rate on the x-axis, the inflation rate on the y-axis, and if these two mirror each other, then they should line up on a 45-degree line here that comes out of the origin. And as you can see, whether it's countries like the US who have a relatively low monetary growth rate, or countries like Argentina that have had fairly high growth rates, the dots line up almost perfectly along this line out of the origin. So our theory about this relationship between money growth rates and inflation rates holds very well. In other words, as the famous economist, Nobel Prize winner Milton Friedman said, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's the amount of money in the economy and the rate at which you increase that amount of money that is going to cause inflation. Now there are some important caveats to keep in mind. One, if the money supply and the velocity rate grow more slowly than real GDP, prices will fall. So imagine, for simplicity, if we don't have any monetary growth, so this is 0, and we don't have any change in the velocity growth rate, and that also is 0, but you do have some increase in real GDP, then that suggests that the price level will decrease. And a decrease in the price level is called deflation. Now don't get confused. Deflation is a decrease in the average level of prices. It's what's known as negative inflation. So for example, if the CPI falls from 100 to 95, then we have deflation. The inflation rate is going to be negative. Disinflation, however, is a reduction in the inflation rate. So all this suggests is that if the CPI rises in one year from 100 to 110, and in the next year it rises from 110 to 112, you still have a positive inflation rate, but it's slowing down. Inflation is growing at a decreasing rate, so we refer to this as disinflation. Another important caveat is that changes in velocity will affect prices. Consider hyperinflation. When there's hyperinflation, people spend their money really fast because they want to spend it before it loses any more value. And so that's going to increase the velocity of money. And of course, as they go out and spend more and more money, that's just going to lead to higher prices. And then consider the case of a Great Depression. During the Depression, people are fearful. And what we had here were people were decreasing their spending. So there was a decrease in velocity. The growth rate of velocity was negative. This would lead to deflation. And what we'll see, we're going to visit the Great Depression in more detail, that just made the Depression even worse. A third caveat is that in the long run, money is neutral. And that's going to be the topic of our next video.